Glenn Greenwald, welcome. Thank you for doing this with us.
I'm so happy to be here. I just wanted to say I'm very well prepared. I don't know if you studied it, but I'm a big believer in method acting, and I spent the last few days navigating life as Sagar. Like I dressed like him, had my friends and kids call me Sagar, so I feel very immersed
where's your
in the
glasses?
No, I'm done. I had to come on as myself. You don't want to like show what you're doing. So,
or
my pocket, my pocket handkerchief as well. But yeah, I'm ready to embody Sagar.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. Sagar was able to join for the A block, so the audience will be able to compare and contrast just how well you do.
Excellent. All right, how well I'm doing. Good.
And we already gave you all your accolades, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, blah, blah, blah. So don't worry, you're properly presented here. I've got a bunch of news stories I want to get to with you. There's a lot of stuff that is like right in your wheelhouse. But before we did that, I wanted to get your reaction to Trump gave an interview to NBC's Meet the Press, Kristen Welker. There were a number of moments that were noteworthy, but I wanted to get your reaction to this one specifically, where he says he's not sure if he's got to follow the Constitution. Let's take a listen.
Some of the worst, most dangerous people on earth. And I was elected to get him the hell out of here. And the courts are holding me from doing it.
But even given those numbers that you're talking about, don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know. I have to respond by saying again, I have brilliant lawyers that work for me, and they are going to obviously follow what the Supreme Court said. What you said is not what I heard the Supreme Court said. They have a different interpretation.
Is anyone in your administration right now in contact with El Salvador about returning Abrego Garcia to the United States?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the Attorney General that question.
So, Glenn, it doesn't surprise me to hear Trump saying like, I don't know if I need to follow the Constitution. Some aspects of his administration, I think I expected basically the direction that he's gone in. But I have to say, as someone who was accused of having Trump derangement syndrome and is still accused of such things, it's actually been much worse than I anticipated. And so I was just curious your perspective on how this is going vis-a-vis your expectations. What parts of it are, pushing further the attacks on civil liberties, some of the authoritarian tactics, et cetera. Just what's your view of how this is all going now that we're more than 100 days in?
It's a little bit of a complex question for the following reason. Obviously, I have been extremely vocal in denouncing countless Trump policies that are clear violations on basic civil liberties, on core concepts of due process and free speech. It's like an onslaught against the Bill of Rights, against the whole idea of having three branches of Congress. These things are very concerning and very worrying and very dangerous. That said, I just wanted to make two quick points about this. One was in that interview that you just showed with Meet the Press. I do think that a lot of times so many of the scandals that became these kind of red alert, 11 on the outrage scale scandals are the byproduct of Trump either trolling or not being very clear. He's a very effective speaker, but he's not a very cogent or clear order of his thoughts. They often get very confused. He cuts himself off in the middle of sentences. I think what happened there was he wasn't saying, I think, that, we may or may not have to abide by the Constitution. The context for that was the Abrego Garcia case, where the Supreme Court, by a 9-0 ruling, ordered the Trump administration to do everything to facilitate his return and then report to the courts what it is that they were doing to be able to prove that they were complying with the Supreme Court order. When President Trump, days later met with Bukele in the Oval Office, and a reporter asked him about that, like, hey, the Supreme Court told you, get him back. It was obvious he hadn't read the Supreme Court opinion. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody that Trump doesn't read Supreme Court opinions. And so he sort of said, I'm not sure. And then he asked Stephen Miller, and Stephen Miller stood up and explicitly and directly lied to Trump, saying, President Trump, we won on a 9-0 ruling. It was 9-0 in our favor, saying we don't have to get him back. And I believe Trump believes that to this very day. So I think in the interview, when she was saying, do we have to abide by the Constitution? It could be a question of, do we have to obey lower court judges, or does the Constitution require you to get him back? But having said that, just on that one issue, I do think that there is this, they came in very prepared. And I kept hearing that throughout 2024 from Trump people. We know what we did wrong the first term. We didn't know what Washington. We had too many people in the administration sabotaging us. They came in with a very clear plan, most of which Trump explicitly discussed during the campaign. And it was all about eliminating any impediments to what Trump wanted to do, not just in the executive branch, but in the entire country, colleges and media outlets and dissidents and activists. And that is where I think they have been so radical and so extreme in a full-scale, very well-coordinated attack on anything that might impede Trump.
Yeah. And that's where, even on this comments, like I hear what you're saying about, well, he's clumsy in how he answered this. And sometimes he can be trolling. He's also flirted with 2028, but then in this interview is like, well, I'm not really that interested in that, et cetera. But when you also layer on top of that, he is also brazenly defying the Constitution in any number of ways. I mean, they think they have a case that they can take this to the Supreme Court about the Impoundment Control Act, but power of the purse has long rested with Congress, and they just feel like they can do whatever they want with regard to not spending funds that have been appropriated, fire whatever they want, run roughshod over the government. Obviously, with regard to the Alien Enemies Act, they just decided, like, we don't have to offer due process, another brazen violation of the Constitution. The assault on free speech with regard to college campuses, not just with regard to foreign students, but also with regard to pressuring universities to, withhold diplomas from American citizens. All of these things are, there was a memo that came out from this government, or their position officially is that they don't need a warrant to go into your home if you are suspected of being a gang member. And apparently being suspected of being a gang member just means like you're maybe from Venezuela and perhaps you have a tattoo. So when you put the comments in the context of, it doesn't seem like this administration does feel like they need to abide by the typical understandings of the Constitution. One of his very first executive orders was to say, hey, we're going to end birthright citizenship, which the language of which is plain as day inside the Constitution. That's one of the ways that I feel like Trump 2.0 is different than Trump 1.0, where there was a lot of merit to the, well, take him seriously, but not literally. This time, I feel like you do kind of have to take him literally based on the actions that they have taken thus far, which really have indulged his most maximalist instincts.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. I should note that several times Trump has been asked in the first 4 to 6 weeks of his administration, if the Supreme Court rules against you, would you ever consider ignoring or violating a Supreme Court order? And he very explicitly said, absolutely not. I would never do so. And the difference between so I'm not saying that means he won't. I'm just saying that idea has been in his head. And
because he basically is right now, right? Especially with regard to, I know they're trying to play this legalese. Oh, well, facilitate means we don't really have to do anything.
No, there's no question they're ignoring it. There's no question, right? Zero question. And they're doing it brazenly and defiantly when they go to a court, a lower court, or an appellate court. Their contempt for their idea that they have to justify what they're doing is palpable. So I agree with you about the difference between the first and second term. This is what I will say, though. I remember when Bolsonaro got elected in Brazil in 2018, he had a long history of just the most alarming and disturbing statements. Like, first thing I'll do is close the Congress. Pinochet didn't throw enough people out of helicopter, on and on and on. And as it turned out, when he got in, the question was, are Brazilian institutions strong and willing enough to confront him, even if it means risk? And the answer ended up being yes. He ended up being actually a very weak president. I think that happened in Trump 1, 2. There was such a mobilization of every institution to try and stop him, in my opinion, almost excessively. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing now, though, Krystal, is some serious pushback that I think can be meaningful. Like I said, Trump lost 9-0 in the Supreme Court. Yes, they're ignoring it. They're not facilitating his return. That's going to go back to the Supreme Court, and we'll see what the Supreme Court does. You see other cases where they lost on a 9-0 ruling as well, with the Alien Enemies Act and whether due process is required before they can deport people. And the Supreme Court said absolutely not only that, but advance notice is required as well. A Trump-appointed judge just 3 days ago, last week, said he doesn't even have the right to invoke the Alien Enemies Act because we're at war. So I just think that a lot of what Trump is doing is extremely disturbing, extremely alarming. We're still in the first 3 months. We'll see if they run out of energy, if they start having internal dissent, but more importantly, whether our institutions can really confront it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I think there's been more of a resistance that has been mounted in recent weeks. And the courts, they take time to act. And one of the things that Trump 2.0 has done, very intentionally is flood the zone. Is just take the chainsaw and just move and just act. You saw this very explicitly with the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. They drafted it. They held it. They got the people they wanted to deport in place, ready to board the planes before they released it publicly. There were immigration attorneys who were starting to get wind of it. That's the reason they were able to cobble together this last minute hearing where the judge says, hey, you have to, even if the planes are the air, you have to turn them around. And again, they just ignore that and, they were over international waters. We couldn't do anything at that point. So sorry. And by the way, since you issued that order from the bench, it doesn't really matter. But in any case, the point is just that because they've been so willing to act aggressively and in ways that they themselves know are probably not going to hold up to judicial scrutiny, it has been very difficult for the courts to keep up. The Democrats have been utterly pathetic in almost all instances.
Seriously? That's so unlike them.
I know, which is, who could have predicted that?
Right.
But, their initial instinct was to be really cowed by Trump 2.0. I think a lot of the media's instinct has been to bend the knee and basically bribe Trump to leave them alone so they can get their mergers through, et cetera. You initially had Columbia University really bending the knee in particular, and other universities getting to follow suit. Now you've started to have, led by Harvard, you've started to have a little bit of backbone demonstrated with the universities, a little bit of backbone now starting to be demonstrated by the law firms as well. Still waiting a bit on the media. I guess we have a few signs of that as well. But, I agree with you that now that Trump has become so unpopular, I think the tariffs have in particular sapped him of a lot of popular support and institutional support as well. I think there's more pushback than there was previously, but I'm concerned about how much damage they can do before things are reined in. And as you know, because you've covered this better than probably anyone, once the executive claims a power for itself, once an executive tramples on our rights, it's very hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Usually you just go increasingly in that direction of whatever power the last president grabs, the next president grabs that power and expands it even further.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on that last point because I think it's such a crucial one. During the campaign in 2016 and then even during the Trump presidency, one of the things that bothered me and concerned me about the liberal reaction to Trump, the maximalist, hair on fire kind of reaction. And I don't just mean things like Russiagate. I mean, just reactions to a lot of the policies, is that so often things were depicted as some sort of singular Trumpian evil that was this radical departure from the American tradition. I remember the first time I really was irritated by this was when Trump invited the Egyptian dictator Sisi to the White House, and the media went berserk and said, this is no American president would have done this, embraced a dictator like this before. And I was like, what? That's the whole history of the post-World War II era. American presidents embrace dictators pretty much every month. It's what they wake up and they do. And there was and so much of what I feel like going through these first 3 months of this civil liberties onslaught is it reminds me so much of those Bush-Cheney years, when I began writing about politics, where the big framework was the administration could do anything. It could put people in prisons with no charges in the middle of an ocean, or kidnap them, or torture them, or spy on people. If you raise questions about it, the answer always was, why are you defending the terrorists? And you would be like, what? The whole point of what I'm saying is that you don't know if someone's a terrorist until they get due process. And they invented all these radical presidential theories about why they can ignore congressional law. And there's an article today by Jack Goldsmith, the Bush-Cheney DOJ lawyer and Harvard law professor in the New York Times, basically saying that most of the policies Trump is embracing, albeit in radically extended and more dangerous form, come from precedents that Obama won, that Biden won, that George Bush won on the extent of presidential powers. And he says that's really the main problem this country has, is we've made the president into a king, which, is exactly what the founders sought to avoid.
Yeah, and the last thing, then we can move on to what's going on with Yemen and Israel and Iran. Some very ominous developments that we'll track. The last thing I wanted to get you on is something that Michael Tracy has been talking about, is the way that this Trump administration seems to think that national security or deeming something a national emergency, as with the tariffs, is a kind of cheat code to be able to just do whatever you want without having to worry about laws, Congress, courts, due process, et cetera. You see that's the Alien Enemies Act. That's the exploration of declaring cartel members enemy combatants. That's the justification for the tariffs as well. And that direction, to me, is also very unnerving because historically the courts have granted the executive a lot of bandwidth to declare what is and isn't a national security threat, what is and isn't a national emergency, et cetera. So they feel like they can just stretch that outrageously to be able to claim effectively wartime powers here at home, with massive blowback on our own citizens, not to mention immigrants who are here as well.
No, that is a massive concern. And that was part of what Professor Goldsmith's article is about, was exactly that. There's these set of precedents. Now, the idea that presidents have virtually unlimited power in war, that's very embedded in American culture. Obviously, Lincoln notoriously suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. We obviously don't have anything remotely close to that. FDR used the Alien Enemies Act to detain huge numbers of Japanese Americans in concentration camps on the grounds that they're alien enemies. And the courts have often approved of these over the decades, creating this almost omnipotent presidency, but most presidents have had some restraints on what they were willing to do, political ones or ethical ones or whatever. And Trump is taking that to the fullest extent. And, again, in the war on terror, that's what was happening. And then finally, you did have pushback from courts. Like in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that even Guantanamo detainees have a right of habeas corpus to go in and see the evidence against them and to question it. And huge numbers prove their innocence from that, showing the dangers of just allowing the president to treat people as guilty before they've been found guilty. But again, I think that Trump is exploiting in a very dangerous way a long history of expanding executive powers, in part because people in Congress don't want that responsibility. They're happy to let the president make tough decisions because they just want to get reelected.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.